let us go ahead and start on up. First and foremost, good afternoon to all of our lunchers and munchers that are visiting with us. Welcome to the Greensboro History Museum's History Lunch Break. I am Catherine Johns. I am the Curator of Education at the Greensboro History Museum. And today we will be hearing from Dr. Heidi Kim on the Japanese American incarceration in North Carolina. History Lunch Break is made possible by the partnership between the City of Greensboro, the Library Department, and the nonprofit Greensboro History Museum, Inc. We are also extremely pleased to have our guest audience joining us. If you'll take the time to view the bottom of your screen, you will see the Q&A icon, and that is what we're going to be using for questions today. By selecting this option, you can type in the question for our panelists, and once you've typed in your question, hit the enter button on your keyboard to submit it. We have reserved the latter part of this program today to field questions. This afternoon, Dr. Heidi Kim is joining us, who is a professor of English and comparative literature at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she also directs the Asian American Center. She is currently working on 2 book projects, very, very advantageous, very good for you. Asian American Literature, a very short introduction for Oxford University Press, and a new monograph tentatively titled Beyond Reparations. She can be seen as a talking head in the new documentary about William Faulkner, The Past is Never Dead, but she explains she is too afraid to watch it for herself. So without any further ado, Dr. Kim, I'm going to hand it over to you, and we are going to be listening in and hopefully eating.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine. Thanks to the Greensboro History Museum for putting this on and for all of the sponsors. I'm always delighted to see people turn out for history. So thanks very much for joining me. And I wish I could be there in person, and hopefully will be in the future.
One day.
Yes. So Catherine asked me to speak about some of the work that I've done on the Japanese American incarceration during World War II, and specifically how it intersected with North Carolina, which is not a history that a lot of people know about. So what I'm going to do is just try to give you an overall introduction to how this really momentous event in our nation's history intersected with this state. And I'm not going to give you a ton of numbers and dates, but just try to kind of give you the narrative of how this history came here. So when we think about the history of the Japanese American incarceration during World War II, there are 2 chief ways that it has been remembered. The first is the military history. So Japanese Americans were not initially permitted to enlist after Pearl Harbor, and those who were already in the services were actually discharged. But as the war turned and the need for manpower grew greater, Japanese Americans were welcomed in and were placed in a segregated army unit. And this is the most famous unit that Japanese Americans served in, though they were also in the intelligence services as well as other branches of the armed forces, which I'll get to actually a little later. The other main history, of course, is the history of the camps. So 120,000 roughly Japanese Americans were incarcerated throughout the duration of World War II. And most of them were in 10 main camps run by a civilian government agency. And these camps extended from California to Arkansas. They're placed in remote locations where the government could get the land or perhaps already owned land, and actually saw this in many cases as an opportunity for land development. So men, women, and children went into these camps. Most of them were US citizens by birth. And at this time, Asians were barred by law from naturalizing. So those who were still subjects of Japan might have been in the US since they were babies even, but could not obtain their citizenship until the laws changed after the war. Out of the camps and from Hawaii, where Japanese Americans were not incarcerated, came these soldiers who composed the 442 and other Japanese American units. And this became one of, if not the most decorated military unit per capita in US military history. So conventionally, with the narrative of Japanese American incarceration, people really think about this as being a West Coast event. And that's because the area that Japanese Americans were removed from was a 100-mile perimeter along the West Coast. So if you look at this map, the part that has the bold line next to it and is labeled exclusion area is the area the Japanese Americans were removed from. And most of the population lived within there. If you lived in the rest of the US, you were permitted to stay, but might have suffered house arrest or property removal or other localized events. And they were moved to, again, camps across the country. And this camp map is already quite complete. It shows a lot of the detention sites. But some of the work that's being done by Densho, a nonprofit history organization that's based in Seattle, has been to really revive the history of all of the detention sites and to show what a nationwide event this was. So when I moved to North Carolina about 14 years ago, I had no idea that there were any connections between this history that I worked on and the state that I was moving to until I accidentally came across a mention of it in the archives in Hawaii, actually. And so that's some of the history that I'm going to tell you about. But my point is that this has not been well known, but I have found, of course, as I've done this work, that around these areas where Japanese Americans were held during World War II, it is a well-known local history. And so it's been great to talk to people about that and learn what are the stories that have been passed down from there, and also to think about the ways that you know, the history wasn't even told completely at that time. Another really important thing to remember is that this event, the Japanese American incarceration, has had a really unusual trajectory in American history. So it is one of the very few events for which the US government has created a kind of full program of reparations, which culminated in the Civil Liberties Act, which was signed in 1988. And so even though it was a very large governmental injustice that was committed during World War II, it is a kind of unusual case in that all three branches of government in their own way and presidents of both parties have repudiated this as historical precedent, even though, of course, there is always continued discussion and controversy in some quarters. So what I'm going to focus on today are a few of the different sites and different ways through which Japanese came to North Carolina during this time. So we've got two sites out in Western North Carolina, one college in Greensboro, Guilford College, one college in Chapel Hill, UNC, and Camp McCall, actually, a military site in North Carolina that some of you may know. So first, we're going to talk about the families that came through. So the families that came through were all from Hawaii. And at the outbreak of war in Hawaii and also on the West Coast, many leaders of the community, mostly men, were arrested. So these are folks who were school teachers, newspaper editors, religious leaders, and similarly positioned people in who were in some kind of position of authority. And in particular, certain religions were targeted because they were seen as very Japanese identified, and in particular, Shintoism was seen as a religion of emperor worship and therefore considered particularly dangerous. So Those men were arrested, but the question was what was to become of their families, what was going to be their ultimate fate. So out of these men who were arrested, some of them chose an option that was given to them that was known as repatriation. And I'm doing air quotes around repatriation because, of course, none of these children, mostly, and many even of these women had never been to Japan, but it was referred to as a program of repatriation. So these families, here pictured on the back steps of the Grove Park Inn in Asheville, North Carolina, who had elected this path, they were shipped from Hawaii to North Carolina. Now, you may all be saying North Carolina is not on the way from Hawaii to Japan. And the reason that they were sent here was basically to hold them somewhere for a period of time so that if they were interrogated upon their return to Japan, they could not offer any current information about the military presence in Hawaii or any of the geographical arrangements of various units. So these women and children had quite a long and arduous journey, as you can imagine, ship, cross-country train, and then they were put in the Grove Park Inn, which, as you may know, is a luxury 4-star hotel outside of Asheville. They were quite astonished by this, and actually, you know, while it was very luxurious, it was also a drain on their resources because they felt that they had to tip the wait staff.
That's so very polite of them.
Yeah, and so there are records of them being very anxious about this because they were only allowed to bring a couple $100s, and so it was quite a strain. It was also a strain on the State Department's resources. So after I'll circle back to this. After their stay at the Grove Park Inn, pictured here in a historical photo and a present day photo, they were sent to Montreat, which I'll move on to next. So just to kind of help you understand better what happened here, this does not scale, right? The majority of Japanese Americans were on the mainland. But if we think about what happened to this group from Hawaii, only 1% of Japanese Americans from Hawaii ended up being incarcerated. It was a much more selective incarceration. And out of those, only 40 heads of the family, again, I think almost all men, chose repatriation. And so the women and the children were the ones who came through North Carolina. And the men at that time were in various other camps before they were reunited with their families and sent back to Japan. So you might be wondering, and a lot of them were able to return in the end because it was considered a choice made under duress, and especially the minor children, some of them were able to return. This is a picture of Jane Asami and her extended family. Her oral history is really the one that helped me to wrap my mind around this history and start working on this. So they were sent next to Montreat, which many of you may know is a town that originated as a Presbyterian retreat, hence the name Mountain Retreat. And they stayed in the College Inn, as it was known, for some months, including over Christmas, before they were moved to their next destination. This is a little note from the Dialect, which was the local college paper, noting the excitement of the Japanese and Germans, as they were known, who were to occupy the inn. So the Germans were on the second floor and the Japanese Americans were on the third floor. This is another family. So Tomo Izumi wrote a memoir that details some of these experiences, and they were at the assembly in Montreat. This is a picture of her whole family. She was very much befriended by Elizabeth Barr Bowers, who was a secretary who worked with them. And Elizabeth, I think, really enjoyed interacting with the children in particular, and it was very common for the children in particular to be asked to dress up in kimono and perform. And so those are a lot of the photos that we have of them is in traditional Japanese clothing, which was, I think, most interesting. Another intersection quickly was with the effort to relocate college students. So there was a lot of suspicion about this, and there were a lot of people who worked very hard to overcome that suspicion. You can see in the quotations here, there's quite a bit of distrust and also kind of just a lack of knowledge. So in this first letter, we note that the faculty members from UNC actually went to go look at the Japanese American students who were at Guilford, literally because, you know, to sort of quote the old chestnut, they'd never seen any before. And so they kind of wanted to see what they were like. Two women ultimately came to UNC Chapel Hill. They didn't arrive until 1946 because the placement took so long, but both of them took a long route out of the camps and ultimately were able to enroll and study sociology. At Guilford College, Ed Hirabayashi, who belongs to a very storied family, was able to come. He was the younger brother of Gordon Hirabayashi, who was the Supreme Court plaintiff in one of the cases about the incarceration. And so his presence has, I think, kind of been better recorded. And last but not least, there was a military intersection. So most of the Japanese American soldiers were trained at Camp Shelby in another state. But I did find records of a few Japanese American paratroopers coming to train at Camp McCall. So here is a photo, actually, of all of the MIS linguist paratroopers who came through in spring 1944, and there are a few other records that remain. This was a really interesting find, and it's one of the least well documented. So you can see that, you know, we really, in this state, had quite a varied relationship and quite a full relationship to this incarceration. And it really was, as I said, a national event and not just something that affected communities on the West Coast. So I'll pause there for questions.
Okay, we have to first a question from Tara Sandercock. Could you repeat the total number of people that were put into these camps?
So in total, across all of the different types of camps, and which includes, you know, various military sites as well, it's estimated around 120,000 Japanese Americans.
It's a tremendous amount of people
Mm-hmm.
who went through a very, very shocking experience.
Yeah.
Our second question is actually from our own curator of collections, Ayla Eman, who is asking, what was the option if they did not choose repatriation?
Oh, great question. Thanks, Ayla. So if these individuals who were in this particular situation did not choose repatriation, then they went into other incarceration on the mainland. So a book that I edited, actually, called Taken from the Paradise Isle, tells the story of a family from Hawaii that did not choose repatriation. And so the wife and children were incarcerated separately. The husband passed through a whole bunch of different military camps. And in the end, you know, they were reunited and they got back to Hawaii, I think, in 1945.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
The next question, you said a little bit on this, but I wanted to know if you had more reactions from people of North Carolina to the Japanese Americans that were coming in to their communities.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to look that up. So, you know, there was a lot of fear and a lot of suspicion. Many people in North Carolina had no familiarity with Japanese Americans. At this time, Asian Americans were still seen as very foreign, very other. And the mere fact of the incarceration, the mere fact that the federal government had thought that this kind of action was warranted, I think quite naturally made people view the entire community with suspicion. So in Asheville and to a lesser extent around Montreat, there was a lot of local nervousness, particularly around Asheville. There were a lot of accounts of, wanting there to be guards, wanting to make sure that they weren't going to be circulating in the local area. At Montreat, they got a very friendly reception. Some of the college students apparently used to swim across the lake and chat with the children and then swim back. There were some efforts at proselytizing them, even though the State Department had said that that shouldn't be done. But I think there were some more friendly relations that were discussed there. And at Camp McCall, there's actually quite an interesting account. Apparently, the commanding officer there put out the word locally that some Japanese Americans were coming to train there. And then he actually went and met their transport himself. And I think that that was a precaution that he was taking just to ensure their safety and make sure that there wouldn't be any local fears.
Probably a
Or
wise choice.
mistreatment. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then a side question I have, you noted that it was that they were designated primarily by religion, and primarily Shinto religion. Is that correct? Were there other religious groups that were pinpointed like the Shinto religion was?
Pretty much all of the non-Christian religions, all of those religious leaders were arrested.
That must have been very entertaining to have a Christmas with people who did not celebrate Christmas as often at Montreat, because I know they were there primarily during that holiday experience, right?
Yeah, they seem to have enjoyed it a great deal. I think that, they appreciated it. Of course, it's, fun to
Yes.
and celebrate it. I think also, these people had in some cases been living in the US a long time or had grown up in Hawaii, and they were accustomed to Christmas. It wasn't like it was strange to them. So there's more cultural mixing probably than in the 1940s was widely known.
Yes, absolutely. So one from Mary Shandor we have here, which is where were the paratrooper linguists Americans of Japanese descent, and what was their mission?
Yeah. So all of these Japanese American paratrooper linguists, as far as I can tell, would have served in the military intelligence services. And so they were primarily deployed in the Pacific because of their linguistic ability. And this was considered extremely dangerous because it was thought that if they were captured by the Japanese, that their treatment would be especially severe. So they haven't been celebrated as much as the 442 because their work was very classified. And so less is still known about it today.
Wow. That is incredible. Is there any hope of maybe getting some more documentation about it at any point in time?
I think so. There have been a couple of books. There were some oral histories. I will say, when I had the privilege of meeting some of these veterans, the MIS vets were often a little quieter and less forthcoming about their work. That training and that habit kind of held very strong.
Goodness knows that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think anyone who has a veteran or military member of their family will kind of understand that.
Absolutely. We have a question from Jenny L and from Tara Sandercock. Both kind of cover similar information, which is Jenny L was asking, the property they owned, was it returned to those that they were displaced or incarcerated? And then Tara asked, If could you say more about the apologies, restitution attempts, those kind of in a similar framework?
Sure. And I think I can also fold in Heather McKay's question.
Mhm.
She's also asking about belongings and property.
Yes.
So this was a real hardship. This kind of economic loss that was caused by the incarceration was pretty severe for the whole community, not just for these particular families, but for all of the 120,000 Japanese Americans. Um, they had to sell their property at a loss. Uh, they, in some cases, stored property or left it in trust and returned to find it destroyed or that their trust had been betrayed. So there were really strong losses. There were a few attempts in 1948 under a specific act to make some restitution, but I've seen some of those files, and if you got it, it was like pennies on the dollar. But also in most cases, people didn't have the kinds of receipts or documentation that the government was asking for. If you sold all of your furniture to some furniture dealer for $15, you probably didn't keep a receipt for that for 6 years. So in most cases, the community just had to absorb those losses.
Oh.
That was a big conversation leading into the reparations. So it was a $20,000 payment to each survivor, and it was largely meant to be symbolic rather than any kind of methodical restitution to each person.
We also have a question from Marie Shandor, which is, do the college students have sponsors or local families to help them at all?
So that varied by college. Students got placed all over the US. Many colleges declined. They didn't want to be involved, or they thought that the campus climate would be unsafe. That may have been a genuine concern. It may have been an excuse. In many cases, faith communities
Mm.
were very helpful for the students. So there was a particular Presbyterian minister and congregation in Chapel Hill, for example, Reverend Charles Jones, who was a very noted figure in the community, very progressive on racial, who was very welcoming to these students, and those students remembered their dinners with Reverend Jones and other families of the church for a long time. So some colleges, I think, it was more college based, especially if there were multiple students who came in, and then the college would kind of help them get settled that way.
We have a question from Kinefuchi. Out of all of these southern states, why North Carolina? Or were there similar cases in other states as well?
Great question. Thank you for that question. So there were some other sites across the South that were used for this. And it was largely a question of where the military or the State Department or whatever the holding government entity was could get space.
Mm,
And so it was very often places like hotels, right?
sure.
Um, and uh, the Assembly Inn at Montreat, for example, they profited hugely from this arrangement, and they were able to make significant infrastructural improvements with the profit that they gained from this arrangement. So there were places that were quite eager to make themselves available because they knew that they'd get this guaranteed profit.
Yeah.
Uh, and you know, as in I think any large movement, folks were looking for space. For example, military, a lot of improvements at my own institution, UNC Chapel Hill, were built to house the flight school that was housed on UNC's campus.
We have one final comment from somebody, and I think that it's a good comment, which is from Marie Shandorigan. So we incarcerated their families and then asked them to serve in the military.
Yeah, that
Yikes.
is what happened, and that was a real difficult thing in the community. So there were many people who were eager to serve. I should say people rather than men, because there were also Japanese American women who served in the WACs and the waves.
Oh,
Um, and so there were people who were eager to serve. There were also those who were resentful of this very paradox that Marie's pointing out. And so there were a lot of debates in the camps, a lot of rifts in the community. And at the time, of course, the proper route, the patriotic route, was seen as, of course, being willing to volunteer or be enlisted. Um, but I would say it's only in later years that folks also recognize those who protested or resisted the draft, and who were in their own way also standing up upon principle,
mm-hmm.
attempting to assert their constitutional rights. But the legacy of that, of course, has been uh, in many cases disputed. People have very different feelings about it.
Absolutely. Well, we are going to have to wrap up now. Dr. Kim, thank you so much. What an incredible presentation. And thank you so much for answering all of our questions. We actually have a number of audience members who have been writing in to say thank you as well, because it's been really wonderful. So a very big special thank you to you for this. We really appreciate it.
Thank you all so much for turning out and for engaging. I love the questions, and you know, my email is just my name, Heidi Kim at unc.edu. And I have loved hearing from people who grew up near Montreat, or maybe went to Montreat as young folks for their education. And I love hearing from folks who have other little tidbits to share. So please feel free to get in touch.
Tomorrow, we're going to go back into talking about the Greensboro History Museum for just a couple of seconds, folks, and then we're going to end. We appreciate every single one of our guest participants today for being here. Thank you so much. And the questions were outstanding. We really appreciate it. Tomorrow, the Greensboro History Museum is hosting our civic season programming, particularly with our Lifted Voices program, which is free from 1 o'clock until 3 p.m. We will also have one of our By the Book presentations, which is called Homefront Battles, continuing our World War II discussions with Dr. Charles C. Bolton on Thursday, June 27th. And the big event, which we will have we have another round of this presentation actually then by Dr. Kim. We'll have this recording replayed. Will be on July 6th for our flashback 1940s covering World War II. This is a day that is filled with reenactors, food trucks, competitions, and they are all about teaching and exploring and understanding better the 1940s and World War II's impact on Greensboro and North Carolina more broadly. The day events are free. However, our night events are ticketed. So please check out our website going to greensborohistory.org. Or you can check us out on our Greensboro History Museum Facebook page, our Instagram, our Twitter, or our YouTube. And this particular live streaming event will be on our YouTube later this week. So if you all will need to check out anything, please do so. Otherwise, thank you all so much and have a wonderful rest of your day.